Hi art nerds, welcome. Today I'm going to show you how to paint this cute Lilliputian lass with her bunny mount. I used Stonehenge Aqua cold press watercolor paper for this watercolor illustration. So the first thing I did was apply an all-over wash using a medium warm yellow to tone the piece. Then I added the same warm yellow to the very tips of the grass, wet into wet, just to kind of lighten things up and to give an impression of light hitting the grass from behind. This is going to be useful later when we apply later or further layers of darker greens. So with watercolor, it's important to remember that it's easier to darken things than it is to lighten things. So you may want to work a little bit lighter or with lighter colors than what you intend for the final piece. Once I finished applying yellow to the tips of the grass, I mixed up yellow, ochre, and scarlet to create a Caucasian skin tone, and I began doing an all-over fill of a very light variation of this skin tone for her skin. I used this same color to paint the cream or white parts on the bunny, so the stomach, the undersides of the legs, the bottom of the tail. I find that it's better to work using a very light color than just leave the white of the paper for very large areas. At this point, I flip my canvas over so it'll be a little bit easier for me to work. You guys can also see I have an object underneath the drawing board. That's to elevate the drawing board by a couple of inches and allow gravity to do its work. So I'm applying a very wet wash of burnt umber mixed with sepia for the ground, and I'm going to apply a little bit of water later on so it becomes a graduated wash. I want the transition between the grass and the dirt to be a bit more subtle, and this is a technique that I found that really helps facilitate that. And there is my clean water. They say to work with the largest brush you're comfortable with using, but since there are so many tiny fiddly parts on this illustration, I'm working with kind of a medium-sized brush. I would say that is a size 10 in Silver Black Swan. So once that is applied, I'm adding in a stronger mix of the same colors, burnt umber mixed with sepia, and I'm hoping to achieve some softer diffuse wet into wet blends, which you can see I'm more successful on our right hand side than I am on our left hand side, since our right hand side was the side that we'd applied later. And I'm just going to keep creating kind of this almost like a stone sort of pattern or a cobblestone sort of pattern. I find that this technique works really well when painting dirt or stones or bricks for illustration. And I'm going to continue to add additional darker mixes of this combination, wet into wet, so that it'll diffuse. Once that's fairly dry, I mix in a really strong mix of sepia for our darkest dirt shadows. While the board is still upside down, I'm going to begin painting the grass. This is a fairly wet mixture of Hooker's green and although you guys couldn't see it, I diffused the bottom of the grass with a little bit of clean water just to get it to blend into the dirt area better and soften that transition so it doesn't look so coloring book. And by coloring book, I really mean harsh transitions between things that are very different in color, whereas in nature, the transition might be more subtle. And although I'm filling in the majority of the grass, towards the tips, towards the ends of the grass, I'm taking care to lighten up my brush strokes and let the brush do a lot of the work. This is slow going, again, because there's so many little details that I have to kind of work around. You could speed this process up by masking off your characters first, but that would be a lot of masking, so I opted to just work around them. Now I flip the watercolor over and I paint I paint the majority of the bunny's fur using a mixture of very watered down burnt umber or burnt sienna and a little bit of Venetian red with perhaps some Van Dyke brown. And even at this stage, I'm using the brush to do most of the work. I'm not just filling in the color. I'm applying it in very short, light brush strokes to help give the implication that this is fur. Next, I add in a really light wash of scarlet and blend it out using clean water. This is for the pink skin interior of the rabbit's ears. I also dabbed in a little bit more scarlet to intensify the color. Now that this has had a chance to dry, I'm going to give it a darker coating of the same color. So this is a lot more of the burnt umber with a more Van Dyke brown. So we're building up into a more chocolatey coat. And I'm referencing wild rabbits on Google as I'm painting this. And if you guys are not familiar with this little cutie, she is one of the Lilliputian lasses from my Inktober 2017 zine, Lilliputian Living. My wonderful art nerds over on Patreon, thank you guys so much for your support. They have access to this zine for free through Gumroad. But if you would like a copy of it for yourself, if you enjoy Tiny People Stories, you can either join me on Patreon and gain access to this zines and loads of other zines, or you can go to my Gumroad and purchase it for yourself. Or you can find me at a convention, and I always have a list of my upcoming conventions in the sidebar of my blog, and purchase a copy from me in person. I would love to meet you, so if you're ever in the same area as me, come say hi. So for this second coat of fur, you can see I'm leaving some of the original brown visible. I'm letting the brush do a lot of the work, and I'm using these really short brush strokes. I'm also using a brush that can hold a lot of paint so I don't have to continually redip, and I'm leaving a lot of the cream fur visible. If you need a little bit of extra help in painting fur, I actually have a watercolor tutorial from World Watercolor Month 2018 where I demonstrate how to paint several different textures, fur included, and I'll make sure to link that in the cards for you guys. If there's ever a watercolor tutorial that you would like to request, don't hesitate to let me know. Maybe I'll do it during one of my Friday night Power Hour art streams. So once I finish painting the fur, I'm adding just a little bit of very watered down ultramarine blue to the tops of her eyes to create the effect of shadow. I'm also adding the same ultramarine blue to her glass canteen. And when that had a chance to dry, I'm adding another layer of the skin tone to her. Once the skin tone has had a chance to dry, I'm adding a layer of very watered down scarlet red to her lips, her underneath her nose, her cheeks, above her eyelids, to the tips of her fingers, the palms of her hands, to her elbows. If her knees were visible, I would add them to her knees as well. Basically anywhere that I want to add blush or where skin crosses over skin. This creates the effect of liveliness. I also added the same ultramarine blue wash to the rabbit's eyes. Now I'm adding a mix of Payne's gray, and while that's still wet, a little bit of black. What's really nice about this cold pressed watercolor paper is it really facilitates wet into wet blending. I have another tutorial where I paint another cute rabbit girl on the Stonehenge hot press watercolor paper, so I want you guys to kind of compare the differences between the two. So now that the blush is dried, I mixed her skin tone just a little bit darker, and I'm going over and adding another layer. So something you guys will notice about my watercolor technique is that it is heavily reliant on layers and glazes to build up the tone I want. This is a technique for people who are patient, but not 3 weeks patient. It only took me about 4 days to paint this painting. So once your skin has had a chance to dry and the bottle has had a chance to dry, I add a layer of very watered down olive green or olive gold to the interior of her bottle, and this is supposed to represent switchel, which is an 18th and 19th century type of energy drink made using vinegar. And it's actually not bad. I've tried it. If you'd like to try it yourself, you can order some from J.A.S. Townsend & Son. That's how I originally learned about it. And I'm adding a layer of very watered down Indian yellow to her hair. This is actually Tanner from my comic 7-inch Kara, his older sister. So I wanted to paint a slight family resemblance. They're both messenger Lilliputians. So I'm adding a very dark red-brown to the rabbit's saddle. My thought process when painting her is she's going to be very close to the ground, and that doesn't always mean green grass. So I wanted to paint her with browns so she would blend in a little bit better with the back of her rabbit. But she loves beautiful blues, as you guys will see. So I'm adding another more saturated layer of the Indian yellow to her hair. And one of the reasons I love Indian yellow is it really shades beautifully. And what I mean by shading, it's a term I've stolen from the fountain pen community. You can get very, very, very light washes and very dark, intense washes. The color builds up beautifully. And it's a very beautiful, transparent yellow. Now I'm adding a little bit of a darker mix of the olive green to her little canteen, and painting another layer on her saddle. And I decided I wanted to carry that color palette through to her clothing. So she's wearing a messenger's tunic and a pair of baggy pantaloons. When I dress Lilliputians, I prefer to dress them for practicality. And it even has little knee patches that would help protect against wear and tear. And just to keep my palette consistent, I decided to paint her little hood the same color to match her pantaloons. That way we don't have a bunch of colors going on that would attract unnecessary attention from predators. At this point, I'm adding a darker layer of scarlet red to her face and blending it out with just a little bit of clean water to soften the transition. And I'm adding shadows to her hair using quinn gold, which is another beautiful color that shades really, really nicely. So once her pantaloons and her cloak have dried, I'm adding in another layer. If you guys are curious what colors I'm working with, you guys can check out this video here on the colors in my daily driver palette. It's a mix of Winsor Newton, Holbein, Magello, a little bit of Soho watercolors, some Sennelier. Basically any colors that I've found while reviewing watercolor sets that I was like, oh, this is a great color, and decided to add to my palette. She's wearing little wooden clogs, so I painted them with a really watered down mix of yellow ochre first and allowed that to dry. That's going to give the impression of a blonde wood. And she's carrying a little brass or a little bronze, like messenger bullhorn basically, but like a messenger's announcement horn. So I'm painting that with yellow ochre first, and then I'm brushing in some of that beautiful quinn gold wet into wet to allow it to diffuse. I'm also using quinn gold to paint the shadows on her clogs, as well as yellow ochre and quinn gold to paint her straw basket that's been attached to her back. It's like a fisherman's basket. I decided to use the same red-brown to paint the tassel on the rabbit. I'm keeping a very unified and simplified color scheme for this illustration. And I decided to go with a burnt sienna and then later a burnt sienna mixed with Chinese orange for the patches on her knees as well as for the undershirt of her tunic. Just kind of keeping with that reddish brown theme. I wanted to go for browns, but I don't want it to be dirt browns or tree browns. I wanted something a little bit warmer and richer, colors that people would wear. This Chinese orange is Sennelier's Chinese orange, and it's a really beautiful orangey brown or brownish orange. Sometimes oranges can be too red. This one is just like an intense pumpkin kind of orange. And I'm leaving the very edges of her sleeves the original color to imply that light is hitting them. So I've got my palette turned upside down again, and now we're working in the grass. So I apply a thicker mixture of Hooker's Green, and just sporadically I use a little bit of clean water to soften the transition between the grass and the dirt. And I'm using long brush strokes to paint the grass, mimicking the shape of blades of grass with my brush. So you want to use a brush that can hold a lot of paint and is also capable of very delicate brush strokes. You guys will see I'm leaving some of that original green visible through the grass. That's to help create lighting and contrast to give it that sort of visual sparkle. And we're not bringing the dark green all the way up to the edges of the grass. We're leaving some of that yellow showing through as though light were hitting the grass in the distance as well. While the grass dries, I'm applying another layer of the burnt sienna and Chinese orange mixture to her shirt. just trying to develop some contrast and some shadows. So at this point, we have basically almost all of the major forms blocked in. It's time to start adding some shadows and refining some of our details. So I have the piece pulled out so you guys can kind of see the piece as a whole. It's good to take the opportunity to step back and examine your work from time to time. That's one of the reasons why it's important to go take breaks, step away, come back with fresh eyes. So at this point, I'm adding another layer to her skin, just trying to build it up and develop it. I also added some Payne's gray to the saddle blanket behind her. And I also used the colors from her pantaloons and her tunic in the saddle blanket. Again, just trying to tie everything together and make it feel like a uniform. I'm also adding Payne's gray as the shadow to the white for her little bandolier that holds her basket on, and it's meant to look like a friendship bracelet, so that type of weaving. And I replicated that in how I inked it and how I'm going to paint it as well. So while I'm not a huge texture person, I don't like my art looking too over rendered. I want it to definitely still feel cartoony. I love using textures to help imply materials, since these are tiny people things, or a lot of my illustrations involve tiny people, or a lot of my comics involve tiny people. I think showing texture to give the reader an idea of what the material actually is, so they can be like, oh, is really important, and it's something I really try to bring to my work. So again, I'm adding just another layer of shadow to her skin, trying to build the color up. On cold pressed paper, watercolors will dry a lot lighter than they went down. On hot pressed papers, colors will dry very similar to how they went down. So now I'm adding some red violet to add shadow to her skin. So basically anywhere clothing might overlap her skin, or skin might overlap her skin, or her skin is turned away from the light, I'm adding shadow there. I'm also using a thicker mix of red violet to add shading and shadow to the oranges on her clothing. Red violet is a good way to add shadow to orange clothing without completely desaturating it. Once the red violet is dry, I'm adding a darker mix of her skin tone over the shadows. Again, just developing colors. I don't want it to feel like, oh, she just added red violet. I want it to feel like an actual shadow. So I painted the hot press rabbit illustration first, and I gave that rabbit very dark blue forget-me-nots as a flower crown, and I wanted to bring that into this illustration as well. So I decided to give her a blue jay feather in her hair that would be a really nice pop of contrast and make the flowers that she and her rabbit are wearing blue and white. So I start with ultramarine, and this is Sennelier's ultramarine. I really like how it handles, and I like its degree of sedimentation. I apply it somewhat washed out for some flowers to paint white flowers, and then thicker for other flowers so that we have those blue forget-me-nots, because I want this to be a diptych. I want this piece and the baby bun rancher piece to kind of go together. Then to add shadows, I use Soho's Urban Blue Violet, which is a really nice dark blue violet color that works really well with any ultramarine. And I blend it out and lift it just a little bit to give that contrast back to the feather. So at this point, I want to start adding some more details to the bunny. It's time to start working on it again, since I spent so much time developing the Lilliputian. And I'm using a thicker mix, but it's not like I'm working straight from the half pan, but I'm using some Van Dyke brown to start adding warm chocolatey shadows to start painting some of the darker hairs on the rabbit. And you guys can see I'm working with a slightly smaller brush. I'm trying to get slightly smaller strokes, but I'm not working with a detail brush just yet. And I'm trying to kind of leave the lighter areas of the bunny unpainted, so as it kind of progresses towards the underside of the rabbit, so underneath the chin, on the stomach, on the inside of the legs, and the little cottontail, I try to leave that alone. Once I finish applying that layer of fur to the rabbit, I paint the interiors of the flowers with a warmer yellow, the same warm yellow I used to paint the grass. And then when that dries, I'm going to paint the flowers using a thicker mix of ultramarine blue. I also used ultramarine blue on some of the beads around the rabbit's neck. I've also decided to add another layer of red violet. Again, a little bit thicker, a little more saturated to continue to develop the shadows on her skin. So now that almost everything's been filled in, it's time to start adding tighter details, more saturated details. And I do this by mixing the paint a little bit thicker. If we were to apply a thin layer of paint on top of something, that would be a glaze, but there's a high chance that glazes will reactivate. So I find it safer to just generally work thicker as I go along. So like with oil painting, we're actually painting fat over lean. We're painting thicker, more saturated, more pigmented washes and glazes and details over thinner, less saturated, less pigmented washes and glazes. Bun wasn't painted in a day, so it's time to add another layer of detail to the rabbit's fur. And this is a much thicker mixture of Van Dyke brown. It's one of my favorite colors in my palette. I use it a lot. It's a really warm, rich, chocolatey brown that has the potential to shade really nicely. You can get a rich medium brown all the way to a very dark brown from it. And I'm working with a slightly smaller brush this time. We're using slightly smaller brush strokes because at this point we're starting to work in more detail. Now at this point I want to start applying more shadow on the rabbit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some Payne's gray to paint in some shadows. Now if I use a very light wash of Payne's gray, a desaturated wash of Payne's gray, it's going to reactivate some of the browns. That could be good. That could break up some areas that are a little too rendered considering the fact that they're in shadows. If I use a thicker mixture of Payne's gray, it's going to really desaturate and cover a lot of what was already painted. So I know this looks really dark and really thick. It's going to dry much lighter. Alright, we've flipped the canvas again and we're adding another layer to the grass. This is a really saturated mix of Payne's gray, Hooker's green with a little bit of Daniel Smith's undersea green mixed in so that we can start getting some of that depth of color. And I flipped the canvas over because it's easier for me to pull those sort of long blade-like strokes towards me. Generally, if I wasn't recording, I would be twisting and turning my watercolor canvas all over the place. But to facilitate recording and because we have this giant stretcher board to deal with, everything is remaining mostly stationary. Once I've painted that layer and it's had a chance to dry, I'm going in with a thicker mix of just undersea green. And after that, I'm going to go in with a mix of indigo. Now I'm using the undersea green to start pulling in some of the shadows of the grass. So we're really trying to create some depth to this grass. Now we're going in with a little bit of undersea green mixed with indigo blue. Winsor & Newton's indigo is actually kind of a very cool influenced indigo that I find works really well for painting grass and foliage. So while the grass is drying, I'm going to go ahead and paint some of the really tiny things that haven't been filled in yet. So the braid on her canteen, I'm going to paint that with yellow ochre to imply rope. And then the little sash that holds her bull's horn to her hip, I'm going to paint that with ultramarine blue, so that it's like an ultramarine blue thread. And I waited to paint those because they're very, very small details, and I had these much larger areas to paint, and I didn't want to paint the small details and then go in and add a wash that would reactivate those small details and cause bleeding. So at this point, I'm just kind of nitpicking small details, adding shadows here and there, just kind of working my way around the painting. And since I was adding shadows to everything else, I decided it was a good opportunity to add some more shadows to the ground as well and show that these figures are casting shadows into the dirt. And I do this using a mixture of, I think it's probably just sepia at this point. I allow my painting to dry overnight so that I can get some fresh eyes and we have a fresh start. And I break out my watercolor pencils. So for this part, I'm going to be using Derwent Inktense watercolor pencils and Supercolor 2 watercolor pencils. These are some of my favorite watercolor pencils. I am using a warm yellow just to kind of reinforce some of those highlights in the grass, to add that yellow back and to create some delineation. I'm also using a very light blue to add some highlights back into our dark ultramarine blue because it starts to get a little bit heavy and opaque. I add white highlights to help break up some of the outline around the rabbit so it doesn't feel like it was copy and pasted into this illustration, and so that it's interacting a little bit more with the area around it. I find that when you're painting furry creatures, it's helpful to do this just to kind of give that look of like sunlight glinting off the fur. If I decide that my application is a little too heavy-handed, I can always wash it out a little bit with some clean water. I'm also using a very fine-tipped brush to add some sepia lowlights, some sepia ticking to the rabbit's fur, since wild rabbits have like black ticking to their fur. So around some of these blades of grass, my control wasn't so great. So I'm going to use a warm yellow just to kind of reinforce that, to cover up some of the mistakes and make the blades of grass seem a little bit more distinct. Next, I'm using some white gouache to add white highlights, and I'm doing this with a really fine tip brush. I really enjoyed working on Stonehenge Aqua's cold press watercolor paper. If you'd like to see a comparison between Stonehenge Aqua cold press and Stonehenge Aqua hot press, you guys can click the video here in the card, so you can check out a link in the description below. That would be a great video if you're interested in knowing which paper to purchase. I'm just adding some finishing details here and there to tighten this piece up, kind of going back and forth between using gouache and color pencils. When you're doing a watercolor paper, it's really all about developing it until you are satisfied with it. So there can be a lot of back and forth that I would do that you wouldn't necessarily do, and vice versa. So next, we're going to remove our illustration from the stretcher board. You want to wait until it's fully dry, and if you happen to use the sidebar as a side palette the way I do, you want to wait until that paint is fully dry for a number of reasons. You're also going to want to remove all of your bulldog clips, of course. Those were used just to help hold the paper tight and secure to our Coroplast stretcher board. And when you are removing the blue tape, you want to pull it away at a 90-degree angle from your illustration. So if it happens to tear, it will tear the paper outside of the illustration rather than tearing into the illustration, which you guys will see demonstrated here. I pulled the camera out to get a better angle for you guys. I used this low-tack blue painter's tape because it is the best thing I have found for stretching watercolor illustrations. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I hope this was useful, helpful, and informative. If you're not a subscriber, make sure you hit that bell button, that subscription button, and then hit the bell so you never miss a video. And I hope to see you guys again really soon with another awesome tutorial. Bye guys!